And to get us started, we've got Dr. Carol Nati. Dr. Nati is board certified in child, adolescent, and adult psychiatry. She received her medical degree at Oral Roberts University School of Medicine and attended Baylor College of Medicine for her psychiatry residency. She completed her fellowship in child and adolescent psychiatry at the University of Hawaii in Honolulu and returned to Texas, where she worked at Vernon State Hospital's Maximum Security Unit as the chief psychiatrist for the competency program. She currently is the medical director of the MHMR of Tarrant County, Pecan Valley Centers, and Helen Farabee Centers. She has been in practice for more than 20 years and remains actively involved in clinical care and teaching. And Dr. Nati is going to introduce us and get us started with a discussion of mental health and intellectual and developmental disability literacy. Dr. Nati.
Well, thank you so much for inviting me to be here. I particularly want to thank Judge Carr. Judge Carr doesn't necessarily always tell you the size of the room you're going to be speaking to when he invites you somewhere, and it's a good thing he didn't. I really am thrilled to be here, and I was told that there's going to be a wide range of knowledge and experience in this room. Some people could teach about mental illness as well as any psychiatrist could, and some people aren't really clear on some of the basics. So they wanted me to do kind of a basic overview of mental health and IDD, and then I'm going to certainly entertain questions if you would like. My talk today is very basic, but hopefully we'll all then be speaking with the same terminology and understand it the same. I will say, when I trained at the University of Hawaii, my residency director at the end of my training said, I want to mention that half of what we taught you was wrong. The problem is we just don't know which half. So what I'm saying today, many years from now, may not seem right, but hopefully I'll be discussing things in terms of the latest literature. So my job is to define what is mental illness and describe mental illness and intellectual and developmental disabilities. And then I'm going to review the Adverse Childhood Experiences Scale so that you know what the common terms are for trauma nowadays, and then address stigma. So let me start with the frequent diagnoses for adults. As most of you know, the major diagnoses that we see that impair people include major depressive disorders, schizophrenia, and bipolar disorders. I would also have to say the vast majority of the patients I see have substance abuse issues that are an overlay, and you can read estimates that this might be up to half of the mental health population. Sometimes I think it might even be more. And in addition, there's intellectual and developmental disorders, which can also have major depression, bipolar, or schizophrenia, or substance abuse mixed in with it. So it's very complex in order to get a lay of all the diagnoses that are out there. In addition, there's anxiety disorders, PTSD, sleep difficulties, and all of these need to be addressed and treated in order for the person to fully stabilize. I will add that the common diagnoses for youth can also be some of the adult diagnoses. You can see depression starting early on. In addition, it's not unusual for me when I'm treating a child or an adolescent to have a parent with bipolar disorder who has a child who's beginning to have the exact same symptoms. And sometimes the parents will say, this is how it started for me. So as we go and look at the disruptive behavior disorders, we would add in oppositional defiant disorder or disruptive mood dysregulation disorder. And then there's also separation anxiety disorder, where kids do not want to go to school and would prefer to be home with their family. I think I might have had a touch of that, but maybe that was for a different reason. But let me start with the definition of what is a mental illness, because we need to have the same language when we speak about these things. A mental disorder is a syndrome characterized by clinically significant disturbance in an individual's cognition, emotion, regulation, or behavior. And this has to reflect a dysfunction in their psychological, biological, or developmental processes. It can't just be that somebody's having a bad day. You have to have significant distress, and it has to impair your ability to function in order to be defined as a mental illness. There are things that can happen in life, such as when somebody dies, and you can go into a significant grieving process. That is not a mental illness. That is part of adjusting to that loss. There's also other socially deviant behavior, such as political extremes, religious beliefs, or sexual behaviors that are between the individual and society, but they're not necessarily mental disorders. I know the Trump rally might elicit people on both sides of the spectrum, but they're not necessarily mentally ill. It can be politically different. So I think that we have to be honest and realize that there is a line which society says impairs a person, and there's a line where it doesn't. So when we talk about severe and persistent mental illnesses, you have to have a mental disorder where emotional or behavioral functioning is so impaired that it interferes with the person's ability to remain in the community without long-term supportive treatment. And here's just a few statistics. I think the statistics are almost shocking at how high they are. Nearly 2/3 of the 45 million US adults over 16 with any mental illness went without treatment. The cost of mental health issues results in an estimated $193 billion in lost earnings. Mental illness is a huge barrier to our society moving ahead if it's untreated. And so I'm going to go ahead and describe the major mental illnesses so that we're all talking about the same ones. And we'll start with depression. So we're going to start with the symptoms of depression, which is frequently feeling sad, empty, or numb, losing interest in things you used to like to do. And my beeper's not right. It could be irritability, particularly in children or young adults. Instead of feeling sad, they're snippy and irritable. Now, I've raised 4 teenagers, and I can tell you irritability is part of teenage years. It has to be excessive. You can have anxiety. Most people with depression have a lot of anxiety. Difficulty making decisions or concentrating. Feeling guilty, hopeless, worthless. Having low self-esteem, and thoughts about death. I always talk about there's 2 types of suicidal thoughts. One type of suicidal thought is called passive suicidal ideation, where you wake up and you just think, I wish I wasn't here. I had this the day I was taking my board exam, and I kind of spoke to God and said, if you're going to kill me anytime soon, please take me before I take this 3-day exam. But the reality of it, most of the time, passive suicidal ideation comes on from stress. And if you're too stressed, you can feel overwhelmed. It is the active suicidal ideation that's worrisome. Active is where you're planning to harm yourself, thinking of things that you could do to end your life. And the active suicidal ideation is when we have to intervene. The problem with depression, and I'm going to just put it up here, is that these people, not my patients, but all, according to the internet, have been diagnosed with major depression. People can often look happy, but be seriously impaired because of depression. And there are many people that you have to look at their lives and realize that the stressors may be very overwhelming for them. As we turn now to bipolar disorder, the symptoms are bipolar, 2 ends of the extreme. You can either be very manic or you can be very depressed. And manic is when you're feeling unusually high or you're very irritable. You have unrealistic expectations about your abilities or powers. You think you're like the greatest. Most of the time that people with bipolar disorder sleep very little, talk rapidly, have racing fast thoughts in their head, and often act recklessly. Patients will tell me they had sex with 10 people in a day, and I'd be like, oh my gosh, I'm so germ-phobic, I can't imagine doing that. But the reality is their judgment becomes impaired, and they often will spend money excessively, do things that are just like, why would you do that? It makes no sense. And the person will often say, I felt like I had no control, and I was like in a dream doing these things. But the other side of bipolar disorder is that they often crash into to severe depressions. And these are the same symptoms that I just listed for major depression. So they can have these extreme highs and extreme lows, and they almost can't control it. So I have been told by a number of parents, like they'll bring in their teenager and they'll say, oh, I think she's bipolar because whenever we tell her she can't do something, she throws a fit. And I'm like, no, that's spoiled. The persons with bipolar disorder seriously cannot control the mood lability. And it's not brought on just by being told, no, you can't do something. They can wake up angry, they can wake up sad, they can wake up elated and not even know what brought this on. So here are some of the people, again, not my patients, got them off the internet, who theoretically were diagnosed with bipolar disorder. Virginia Woolf, of course, the author, Abraham Lincoln, Britney Spears, Buzz Aldrin, all apparently have suffered from bipolar disorder. And so you can be quite successful and have bipolar disorder. You can be very well functioning, particularly if you get on a medicine that stabilizes you. I've met many people who have been on medicine for years who are high functioning and you would never know. But if they get off the medicine, the mood swings come back. And so most of the time it's controlled via medication. And then, of course, the next diagnosis is schizophrenia. Schizophrenia symptoms are seen with, often you'll first see social withdrawal. Most of us probably knew somebody in high school or college who seemed to be like kind of becoming the loner kid. Often they might have suspiciousness or paranoia. There's often a deterioration in personal hygiene. They might have a flat facial expression, not showing a lot of emotion. And then the classic symptoms of schizophrenia are hallucinations. So patients may hear things or see things that are absolutely real to them, and it's just absolutely frightening. I know one of the most frightening things I ever did was that they have these headphones and visual things you can put on in order to experience psychosis. And my gosh, they had this machine that there were smells and I thought there was smoke coming up and it was like so real to me. And I was thinking, oh my gosh, how torturous it would be to live not knowing what's real and what's not real. In addition, they can have sleep disturbances, odd or irrational statements or beliefs, difficulty concentrating, and sometimes they will make up words or use words in a strange manner. Those are neologisms. So when we talk about hallucinations, you can hear things, well, basically any of your senses, hearing, seeing, tasting, smelling, touch, any of those things can be affected. The ones we're most concerned about are the auditory hallucinations because people can hear things that could be good or could be bad. I always talk about when my mother had dementia and was dying, I would go visit her and I'd go to like sit on her bed and she'd be like, oh, don't sit there, there's an angel there. I'm like, okay, I'll sit over here, whatever. But it was interesting because the doctor said to me, do you want her on an antipsychotic? And I'm like, why would we treat something that she's so happy with? She was at her end of life and I would never want to take that away from her. However, there are plenty of patients who have command hallucinations that are very negative, or they will hear horrible persecutory things like you're no good or you're a slut or this or that. And they are tortured by these voices. Those are the people that really desperately need treatment in order to take that away. I've had plenty of patients say, no, I hear my dead father tell me, keep going, you're doing great. And I honestly am not going to medicate away something that a patient tells me is comforting to them. But there are certainly also delusions which are concerning. And the delusions could be like of grandeur. People will believe they're God. I remember when I was at JPS Hospital, there were times there were like 2 or 3 people who believed they were God on the unit who would be fighting each other over this. And I would be like, oh my gosh, I mean, it sounds amusing, but they honestly believed it, And I said to one guy, he was quoting the Bible, and I said, well, does it say in the Bible that you're God? And he's like, I wrote the Bible. I'm like, oh my gosh, it was hard for me to realize this was really embedded a belief system in that person's mind. There's also other delusions, persecution, people are trying to poison me or they're following me, or delusions of reference, the message on the television was meant for me. I think sometimes Sears hits it pretty good and that message is meant for me and I go out and buy what's on the TV, but it's more than that, it's a real belief. And then, whoops. Delusions of control. There are many people who believe that a chip has been implanted in them. They really are distrustful of like dentists and believe something's been put in their tooth, or that the CIA is robbing them of their thoughts, things of this nature. I like to make the distinction of, if I have a delusion, let's say my fixed belief is my husband's the hottest guy in Texas. As long as it's not bothering anyone, and trust me, he's not. And if it makes me happy and all, it's a fixed delusion, but it's okay. But if it's a delusion that impacts you negatively, or if you're acting on that delusion in an irrational manner, then it's not good, and then we have to intervene. So there are lots of people who walk around who are delusional, but their delusion has to be something that's dangerous, or that we had like a guy who used to believe he needed to live in trash dumpsters because that was the only way that like rays couldn't get to him. Well, it was one thing for him to believe that. It's another thing to be living in a trash dumpster. But one day, like, the trash dumpster dumped him into a trash truck, and they were, almost killed the man. This is when we've crossed the line into it being dangerous, and we really need to intervene. So here's some of the people who have theoretically been diagnosed with schizophrenia. Of course, Sid Barrett from Pink Floyd, John Nash, the mathematician. I think they made a movie about him, A Brilliant Mind. And then Amanda Bynes. I put this on here because this is her as an actress that the younger crowd would all know. And then that was her when she apparently was suffering from mental illness. As you can see, grooming took a major toll. There may have been drugs involved in this, I do not know. But the reality is, sometimes it's like the chicken and the egg. Did the schizophrenia come before using drugs, or did sometimes drugs set off the psychotic symptoms? And so it doesn't really matter. At a point, you need to treat the psychosis when it's bothersome to the person. But I'm going to start with some of the facts that we need to know. Most people with mental illness are not violent. Most violent crimes are not committed by people with mental illness, and mental illness is treatable. I think that everyone knows that according to SAMHSA's National Survey on Drug Use and Health, 5% of the American population has a serious mental illness. But that's defined as a disorder that I said impairs their level of functioning. Only 3 to 5% of violent acts are attributable to people with mental illness. And then researchers have found that the prevalence of violence of those with a major disorder who've received treatment and were free of substances was the same as the regular population. But people with mental illness are far more likely to be victimized in violent crimes, 2.5 times more likely to be attacked, raped, or mugged than the general population. And one survey said that they were 11 times more likely to be a victim of a violent crime than the general population. This is unacceptable. This is unacceptable. So let's talk now about the definition of behavioral health. It's now the preferred term for, mental health, and it includes treatment of all diagnoses in mental health clinics, including substance use disorders and intellectual and developmental disorders. So let's talk about, just briefly, substance use disorders. I realize this isn't a conference on substance use, but I cannot talk about mental illness without saying that the comorbid substance use disorders are seen everywhere. When I trained at Baylor years ago, an alcoholic was an alcoholic, and a heroin addict was a heroin addict. Nowadays, you see this vast array of mixture of things people take. I am absolutely stunned. I'm worried about drinking water, but that isn't purified. But there are people who will take substances they buy off the internet or off other people, and they are often mixtures of cocaine and heroin and amphetamine. And so nowadays, when you're treating somebody who's using substances, they often don't even know all the substances that they've been ingesting, which makes it very dangerous for a doctor who's trying to detox them to take care of them so that you don't do something that could potentially worsen them. But the substance abuse warning signs are increased use of substances over time, increased tolerance where you need more and more of the substance in order to get the same response, difficulty controlling the use, symptoms of withdrawal, a preoccupation with the substance, and then giving up important activities when people start missing work or doing things with their family or going to school. And to me, one of the most important symptoms is continuing to use even when you realize that you probably should be stopping. That's when you know we have a substance use disorder. So let me flip now, and we're going to talk about intellectual disabilities. These were formerly diagnosed as mental retardation, and intellectual disabilities, the normal IQ is 100, give or take 15 points. I would bet that most of you in this room are probably in the 130 range, which would be gifted or higher. But when you test, if somebody tests with an IQ of 70 or below, they would probably qualify for having an intellectual disability. A controversial thing happened that they mixed together intellectual disabilities and developmental disorders into one category. So I'm not so good at explaining this, but you can have an autism spectrum disorder and be exceptionally bright, but still be considered treatable in an IDD clinic. So I want to make that distinction for you, that there can be people with a lower IQ in an IDD clinic or people with a developmental disorder in that clinic. They're grouped together. But an important point is that the symptoms must be there before the age of 18. So if you go into a nursing home and there's a bunch of people with various dementias and you do IQ testing on them, there will be lower IQs, but that's because of dementia. That is not because of an intellectual disability. Some intellectual disabilities have to have started in youth and meet the criteria at that time. One problem is people with IDD are not always recognized as having a disability, and often they go undiagnosed or misdiagnosed. They're, especially evaluators in law enforcement, don't necessarily understand that if they're not trained in the assessment of people with intellectual disabilities, they may not recognize them because people try to cover up their disabilities. If you say to somebody, "What's the date?" and you say, "Oh," they say, "Oh, you know, it's a day after yesterday," or something like that, and they joke about it. But you have to press them and say, "But what is the date? What is today's date?" Because they try to avoid answering questions in order to cover up the facts that they don't know. But here are some facts that we do need to know. Mental illness and IDD can co-occur. This happens in about a third of the population with IDD, and sometimes we call that having a dual diagnosis, when you have more than one diagnosis at a time. But as I said, people with IDD are victimized at higher rates. They're 2 times more likely to suffer from violent crimes, and as I said, 4 to 10 times more likely to be abused or be a victim of crimes. Their cases, however, are rarely investigated and sometimes not even prosecuted because of discrimination, devaluation, and prejudice. They are not considered necessarily good witnesses, and so people don't necessarily take their statements to be true. And unfortunately, people with IDD can be victims of violent crimes. They can also be financially exploited, sexually exploited, and victims of human trafficking. I remember working at North Texas State Hospital on an IDD unit, and some of the women were pregnant, and I was like, how could they have voluntarily consented to sexual activity with their level of functioning? And you really had to investigate whether they were being victimized or not. So concerning facts that I'd like you to know are that people with IDD are often denied redress. They're often denied due process, and discrimination definitely does occur in sentencing, confinement, and release. They often are denied opportunities for legal redress because of sometimes stereotypic views of their credibility, their competence to testify, or their need for advocacy, supports, and accommodation. And so I'd like to just stress that there was recently a study of people with with IDD, and according to this 5-year study of alleged or convicted perpetrators with IDD, the study found that people with IDD were more likely to be arrested, more likely to be persuaded to confess, more likely to be refused bail, probation, or parole, more likely to serve longer sentences, more likely to face misperceptions, negative attitudes, and prejudice, even from people within the judicial system. I am saying this not to make anyone feel bad, but to open your eyes to the fact that these people need our help and our protection within the system. So numbers to know. 4%, less than 4% of the population has IDD, but up to 10% of jail and prison populations have disabilities. And people with IDD are more likely to be arrested, convicted, incarcerated, and serve longer sentences. But we also need to know that people with IDD often don't report crimes, because if you think about it, sometimes the person that's victimizing them is also their caretaker. And so it's a very difficult situation where the police and courts have a difficult time intervening. These people often don't have good supports, and as I said, often aren't considered credible witnesses. So now, if you're going to talk about mental health nowadays, you have to know trauma. And I don't know how many of you know your ACEs score, but I'm going to teach you how to do your ACEs score right now. It's a 1 to 10 scale, or 0 to 10 if you've had no adverse childhood events. But research was done at Kaiser Permanente and the Centers for Disease Control, and the research showed that early life trauma correlated with poor health status. Now, all of us have 10 fingers, so we're going to count if any of these 10 things have happened to us in our childhood. So there's 10 questions. It's 1 point for each question, and it's if any of these things happened to you before the age of 18. So let's do question 1. Did a parent or other adult in your household often swear at you, insult you, put you down, or act in a way that made you afraid that you might be physically hurt? So if you can answer yes to that, it's 1 point. Question 2, did a parent or other adult in your household push, grab, slap, or throw something at you, or ever hit you so hard that it left marks or you were injured? Last night at dinner, we were talking about a lot of people in the South had switches, and I was like, what? I was like, that sounds brutal, but anyhow, you know, people our generation often got hit and it left marks. So you get a point if that ever happened to you. Question 3, did an adult or person at least 5 years older than you ever touch or fondle you, or have you touched their body in a sexual way, or try to actually have oral, anal, or vaginal sex with you? If you look at some of the statistics, sometimes the statistics vary among women. Probably a quarter to a half of women were either sexually abused or somebody attempted something inappropriate before the age of 18. And if you look at males, of course, males often won't admit it. The different studies say 10 to 25% of males might have had an incident like this. So you give yourself 1 point if that ever happened. Question 4, did you often feel that no one in your family loved you, or that you were not important or special, or your family didn't look out for each other, feel close to each other, or support each other? Now, I'm a child psychiatrist. If I were to give you one bit of advice I learned in child psychiatry for 30 years, I would say make sure that if you are in a child's life, you tell them you love them every day. It is the most important thing you can do to prevent poorer outcomes later in life. And if you are just a friend of a child or an uncle or somebody, a neighbor, tell that kid something special about them when you see them, because we can do so much more to prevent these negative things happening. Question 5, do you often feel that you didn't have enough to eat, had to wear dirty clothes, had no one to protect you, or your parents were too drunk or too high to take care of you or take you to the doctor if you needed it? That's a point if you had that. Question 6, were your parents ever separated or divorced? In today's society, very common. Question 7, was your mother or stepmom often pushed, grabbed, slapped, or had something thrown at her, or sometimes or even kicked, bitten, hit with a fist, or hit with something hard, or ever repeatedly hit over at least a few minutes or threatened with a gun or knife? Question 8, did you live with someone who was a problem drinker or alcoholic, or who used street drugs? In fact, most of the time when I'm talking to kids or adolescents and I'm talking to them about where'd you get the drugs, they're like, oh, I got it out of my mom's stash. And you're like, what? You know, like, what is wrong with our society that we're leaving stuff like this out in front of our children? Number 9, was a household member depressed or mentally ill, or did a household member attempt suicide? Or 10, did a household member go to prison? So you add up what your score is. Let me talk to you about a high ACE score. A high ACE score would be anything over 2, but if you score 4 or more, then it's particularly concerning. Now let me tell you what the outcome is. If you have a high ACE score, you're more likely to smoke, drink heavily, have hallucinations, suicide attempts, depression, or teenage sexual behavior. In addition, if you have a high ACE score, You have increased likelihood of increased physical problems, heart disease, strokes, cancer, diabetes, emphysema, hepatitis, and obesity. So trauma is the #1 health concern in America today, if you look at it, in terms of the people who have been most traumatized are often the ones who feel most trapped or hopeless. Trauma can be brought about by sights, sounds, or feelings that bring out symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder. And trauma is probably the one thing that we can do the most to reverse. So in our agencies, we need to have trauma-informed care, which means that you understand and recognize and respond to the effects of trauma and understand that there are physical, psychological, and emotional safety that we need to provide for our consumers and help survivors rebuild a sense of control. Currently, nationwide, literature suggests that trauma is one of the greatest health threats there is, and that these profound trauma events in your childhood affect your adulthood. Now, I would also say, I would be shocked if there's not some people in this audience who have very high ACEs scores, because sometimes people who were traumatized want to prevent it, want to do good, want to work with others, and they move on to help others in life. So it was interesting, at MHMR, our executive leadership team took the ACEs thing, and we did it anonymously, and then we looked at the scores, and there were many people who had scores over 4 in leadership roles. So trauma can adversely impact you or motivate you to move on and help others. But this is an epidemic in our country. So what can we do? Make sure that you know what trauma looks like. Don't ask people what's wrong with them, but try to understand what's happened to them and be empathic and kind. If I could add one thing in my experience, it's always be kind to people, because when they start telling you their life stories, I just think, I'm shocked you're still here. You know, some of our people we work with, we are all fighting personal issues every day. And remember that those we are serving often have had much harder lives or have a lot of trouble coping with the traumas that have happened in their life. So trauma-informed sites realize the impact of trauma and understand paths for recovery. We try not to re-traumatize people, which is a big issue. Don't put people down, berate them, be negative with them. You also have to have fully integrated knowledge about trauma in your policies, procedures, and practices to make sure that you treat people well, and actively work to try to provide a safe environment, connect with people, and then empower them to do better. I also want to mention stigma. I'm almost done. Stigma is when you have a negative view of somebody really without necessarily a basis for it. And stigma causes us sometimes to have a reluctance to seek help or treatment. There's often a lack of understanding by the people around you, and stigma can cause you to have fewer work opportunities or school or housing opportunities. It can cause bullying, harassment, violence, and people with mental illness will often have a stigma against them and a belief that they won't get better, which is wrong. So what we need to do is to practice patience, speak in a respectful manner, never be condescending, be aware of your facial expressions. Like sometimes there's people telling me things and I'm just like, oh my gosh. And I'm trying not to look shocked about the things that they're telling me have happened to them. If somebody raises their voice, I always speak a little softer. Works pretty good with husbands too. Try to de-escalate the situation. And I just always be very respectful. If I can just underline that, because when someone feels respected and heard, they're more likely to work with you. So let me get to the point of closing. If a person has experienced events like hallucinations, I need you to be aware that those things are very real to them. Don't try to make fun of them or say that you understand have the same thing. And don't underestimate your patients and think that they're dumb because these things are happening to them. Some of the brightest people in the world have had mental illness. Mental illness has nothing to do with your intelligence level. So I always told my patients, if I was at JPS and, my gosh, we did so many mental health hearings committing patients for longer-term treatment, I'd say to them, I got to go to court today and tell them you need more treatment. And I never lied about it, because they would say, I don't. And I'm like, well, hey, you can say what you think, and I'm going to say what I think, and it's up to the judge. I love to blame the judge. Let the judge decide, honestly, that's how it is. I always tried to tell people the truth. This is what's going to happen. I would say, I'm not a lawyer, but you want to speak with your lawyer about these possibilities and what your choices are. I always try to communicate clearly with persons. I set limits with them, but in a polite manner where I say I only have 5 more minutes. I think we only have 5 more minutes now. And I try to realize that some of these patients are very sensitive to sound, light, things that can startle them and have a welcoming environment. So remember, you are the front lines. You are the soldiers in this war against trauma and mental illness. And it's important that we always be therapeutic and helpful because we don't want to make things worse. I realize this work is hard, and what you do every day matters. You may not think it at times when you roll out of bed, but helping persons who sometimes cannot help themselves is the greatest gift we have. So let me underline, be patient and respectful because you are the true champions working out there. And I believe our true value lies not in what we do to change in our money, but what we do to change lives for the better. I want to encourage you to work with persons with mental illness and realize that you are so important and can really change lives for the better. Thank you very much. Did anyone want to have a comment or question? Yes. Oh my goodness. I don't have that exact statistic, but I know that I read somewhere, I would anticipate 3/4 of them, if not more. If you think about the childhoods of some of these people, it's just shocking. Like, I raised my children and like they were in every activity and they went to a great school and we did everything. And there were times where I was worried they were going to go down the wrong path. But it was interesting when I was in juvenile justice center seeing kids, like these kids sometimes would say, yeah, my mom told me to take it so that if she got caught, she's on probation, so I don't want to have to live with my grandma again because she just got out of jail. And, I'd be taking these histories, and there's this intergenerational thing that happens. And so what the literature suggests with trauma is that if you were abused in some way, you're at a higher risk of abusing other people in that way. And I noticed that at times, my parents would sometimes call me like, I don't know, dummy or something. And I remember having to check myself with my kids to not necessarily propagate that. But I didn't have significant like beatings or abuse of that manner, but people who did often continue this. So what our job is to try to break that cycle. And I would bet that the vast majority of people in jail have had significant trauma, and that we really need to understand they're coming from a level where they're doing the best they can with what they've been raised with or what their environment has provided for them. And we have to help them do better. But that's a great question. Anything else? Okay, well, thank you so much for your time and attention.
Thank you, Dr. Nati. We are running a little bit ahead of schedule right now, but don't worry, we won't let it continue. But we are going to take a little bit of a break now, and we will reconvene at 10:15 to hear from Dr. Keller. I want to add a couple of housekeeping points that I omitted from the earlier list. Number one, the good news is that there is such attendance today that people are having trouble finding seats. So if you have some extra seats at your table, please raise your hand, and some of the folks who are standing will filter in and find a location. Secondly, we have confirmed the location for the reception this evening. It will be the second floor foyer, and I'll announce that again this afternoon. I also want to make an announcement regarding continuing legal education and CEU credits. The attendance today, full attendance, will qualify you for 10.5 hours of continuing education credit. CEU credit, folks who are going to seek that will have to sign in for each session, and there's a table outside of the ballroom here where you can do that. And with that, we'll take a break and then reconvene at 10:15 to hear from Dr. Keller. Thank you.